Chapter number 13 of The Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, 1772 to 1774, Second Voyage. Part 1. Saying goodbye to his family on the 21st of June, Cook, accompanied by Mr. Wales, left London for Sheerness, and the next day dropped down to the Nore. The Resolution was now drawing only 15 feet 10 inches of water instead of 17, a very satisfactory improvement. She was given a good trial on a wind and was found to answer exceedingly well. On the 3rd of July they arrived at Plymouth, having been boarded the day before by Lord Sandwich and Captain Pallisser, who were on a tour of inspection, and Cook had the pleasure of giving them a satisfactory account of his ship. I had not one fault to allege. On arrival at Plymouth, Cook found that orders had been given to the stores that he was to be supplied with whatever he thought necessary, but the only things required were larger coppers for the distilling apparatus, the ones they had on board having proved far too small. The officers and crew were paid up to the 28th of May, and the petty officers and men also received 2 months' advance, to enable them to provide necessaries and extras for the voyage. Cook remarks, the payment of 6 months' wages to the officers and crews of these 2 sloops, being nearly all they had due, was an indulgence never before granted to any of His Majesty's ships. Cook now received his final orders, which he had assisted to draw up. In fact, nothing was now inserted that I did not fully comprehend and approve of. He was to call at Madeira for a supply of wine, to sail for the Cape of Good Hope and there refresh his men, then to look for Cape Circumcision, placed by Monsieur Beauveau in 54 degrees south, 11 degrees 20 minutes east, to determine if it formed part of a continent, and if so to explore it, following the coast and endeavouring to get as near to the South Pole as he could without endangering his ships or crews. Should Cape Circumcision prove to be an island, or should he be unable to find it, he was to proceed as far south as he thought there was a probability of meeting with land, and then steering east, circumnavigate the world in as high a latitude as he could. In case of meeting with land, he was to explore as far as time would permit. When the season rendered it unsafe to remain in high latitudes, he was to retire to the north to refit and recruit, and at a proper season to return to the south. In any unforeseen circumstances he was to use his own discretion, and if the Resolution should be lost, he was to prosecute his voyage in the Adventure. A copy of these orders was given to Captain Furneaux, and in case of separation the following rendezvous were named: Madeira, Port Praya in the island of St. Iago, the Cape of Good Hope, and New Zealand. Forster saves ship. The Forsters evidently were far from pleasant travelling companions, and at one time or another seemed to have quarrelled with everyone on board the ship. At the first the father was dissatisfied with the accommodation allotted to him, and offered Mr. Cooper £100 to turn out of his cabin. When this offer was declined, he tried to force Mr. Gilbert, master, to give up his, threatening if he refused he should be reported to the King and turned out of the Navy. This threat appears to have been a favourite one, and soon became a byword with the seamen, who, according to Mr. Wales, would use it at each other on every possible occasion. But according to his own account, Mr. Forster was able to save the expedition from a very great disaster on the 12th of July. He says he came on deck and noticed the ship was adrift from her moorings. Neither the officer of the watch nor the lookout had seen it till he called attention, and then, after a scene of the greatest confusion, the ship was fortunately brought up within a few feet of the rocks. On the other hand, the master's log admits the Resolution got adrift, but before Mr. Forster reached the deck, the fact had been reported to the captain. All hands turned up, the jib and forestaysails set, and the ship quietly dropped down into the Sound and anchored, never having been in the slightest danger. The only other one to notice the affair was Midshipman Willis, who simply states, "dropped from the buoy and anchored in the Sound." Having received the private signals of the East India Company's Navy, and letters of introduction from the Prince of Orange to all the principal officers of the Dutch East India Company, instructing them to afford every assistance that might be required, Cook hoisted the signal to the Adventure to weigh anchor at 5 a.m. on the 13th of July, and with a north-west breeze the two ships sailed for Madeira. When well out in the Channel, the Resolution's crew was mustered, and it was found that, owing to a mistake of the clerk, there was one man more than the complement, so John Clohan was entered on the supernumerary list for wages and victuals. On the 23rd they were able to relieve a small French boat from Ferrol to Corunna, which had been blown far off her course, and had been short of water for a fortnight. The day following they fell in with 3 Spanish men of war. Cook says, "The sternmost hoisted English colours and fired a gun to leeward, and soon after hoisted his own proper colours and spoke with the Adventure. It appears she inquired who they were and where they were going, and finally wished them a good voyage." This account did not satisfy Mr. Forster, who waxes eloquent and describes the event as a scene so humiliating to the masters of the sea. He must have formed a strange opinion of Cook if he thought for a moment he was one to put up silently with anything humiliating to the British flag. Mara, in his journal, points out that the build and rig of the ships were unusual for men of war, and that when the Spaniards found they had stopped King's ships, they made a proper apology and very politely took leave, wishing them a good voyage. The first loss. At Madeira, where they arrived on the 29th of July, they were kindly received by Mr. Lonan, a merchant of Funchal, who entertained some of the party at his house throughout the stay, obtained permission for the Forsters to explore the island, and procured for the ships the stores that were required. Here Cook, with his eye on the scurvy, purchased as many onions as he thought would keep good, and ordered them to be served out regularly to the crews as long as they lasted. A further stock of fresh food, in the shape of fowls, pigs, goats, and fruits, chiefly oranges and bananas, were laid in at Port Praya, where they had called for water. On the 19th the first death occurred. One of the master's mates, Henry Smook, was at work on one of the scuttles, and falling overboard was seen under the stern. Every effort was made to save him, but it was too late. Cook says he was a good steady man, whose loss was often felt during the voyage. On the 27th of August, Cook learnt that the Adventure had also had her losses. 2 midshipmen, Lambrecht and Kemp, had died of fever, brought on, Captain Furneaux believed, by bathing and drinking too much water under the hot sun of Port Praya. At this time the Resolution had a clean bill of health, but for fear lest the heavy rains, to which they were constantly subjected, might cause sickness, the ship was constantly fumigated, washed down, and thoroughly dried by means of stoves, as advised by Captains Pallisser and Campbell, with satisfactory results. On nearing the Cape, a sharp but unavailing lookout was kept for a bank which had been reported, and on the 30th of October they arrived at Table Bay. The run from home was considered to have been good, as they had in great measure escaped the calms they had been told to expect at that season of the year, and the currents, though very strong, had only caused a difference between the longitude obtained by observation and that of dead reckoning of 3/4 of a degree. So Cook concluded that those north of the equator in the one direction were balanced by those to the south in the contrary one. On landing they were received by the Governor, Baron Plattenberg, who told Cook he had received orders from Holland that the two sloops were to have every assistance that the place afforded. He also said that the two French ships, commanded by Monsieur de Kerguelen, had discovered land in 48 degrees south, near the meridian of Mauritius, but after sailing along the coast for about 40 miles, he had been blown off by a heavy gale, in which he had lost both boats and men. Two other French ships had also called in March, which were on their way to explore the South Pacific under Monsieur Marion. Wales and Bailey got their instruments ashore in order to make observations for the purpose of correcting the watch machines. That made by Kendall was found to be working well, and gave the longitude within 1 minute of time when compared with that fixed by Messieurs Mason and Dixon in 1761. The first lieutenant of the Adventure, Mr. Shank, who had been ill almost from the day of leaving England, applied for leave to return home, as he felt unfit to proceed, and Mr. Arthur Kemp was made first lieutenant, his place being taken by Mr. James Burney. Mr. Sparman, a former pupil of Linnaeus, was engaged by Mr. Forster as an assistant, and makes his appearance in the roles as servant. The crews were well looked after, as much time granted on shore as possible, and fresh meat, fresh vegetables, and fresh baked bread were served out daily in ample quantity, so that when the ship sailed to the southward they were all in as good a condition as when they left England. Cook found time to write a letter of farewell to Mr. Walker, as it was customary for men to take leave of their friends before they go out in the world, for I can hardly think myself in it, so long as I am deprived of having any connection with the civilized part of it, and this will soon be my case for 2 years at least. He at the end speaks of his ships, both well provided and well manned, and of the Resolution he says, "I can assure you I never set foot in a finer ship." The first ice. On the 22nd of November they sailed for the south, and soon began to feel the colder climate. The warm jackets and trousers provided by the Admiralty were served out, extra cuffs to protect the hands being sewn in, and warm-lined canvas capes being made. From the 29th to the 6th of December they were involved in such a heavy gale that the ships were unable to carry any sail, and a large quantity of the livestock bought at the Cape perished from the effects of wet and cold. A scuttle, which had been insecurely fastened, was burst open by the sea, and a considerable quantity of water was taken on board, but beyond necessitating some work at the pumps, and rendering things unpleasantly damp for a time, no damage was done. It, however, gave Mr. Forster an opportunity for an account of the terrible danger they were in, and most wonderful to relate, to speak well of the conduct of the crew. The ships were carried so far to the east by the gale that Cook gave up the idea of searching for Cape Circumcision for the present. On the 10th the first ice was encountered in latitude 50 degrees 40 minutes south, and a little higher they were stopped by a large field, to which they could see no end, either to the east, west, or south. This field was followed along to the south-east for some days, but no opening was found, so being in constant danger from detached pieces, Cook reluctantly gave orders to change the course to the northward. About the middle of December signs of scurvy began to show, and extra precautions were at once taken. Fresh wort was served out regularly to all hands, and the worst case received considerable benefit from the treatment, although rob of lemons and oranges, a sort of jelly made from the fruits, had no effect. Furneaux reported at this time that he had cured 2 very bad cases with the rob. Ships parted. When they had got thoroughly clear of all signs of ice, Cook once again turned south, and by the 26th of December had worked down as far as 50 degrees 31 minutes south, 26 degrees 57 minutes east, where, though surrounded by large masses of floating ice, they steered to the west, leaving the main ice field to the north of them. Gradually working down to 60 degrees south in the longitude given for Cape Circumcision, and being some 95 leagues further south, with no signs of land, Cook concluded that Monsieur Bouvet had been deceived by the ice. Bouvet Island was discovered by the German deep-sea discovery ship Valdivia on the 25th of November 1898. The position was fixed as 54 degrees 26.4 minutes south, 3 degrees 24.2 minutes south, and not 54 degrees south, 11 degrees 20 east, as given to Cook, which will account for his want of success in the search for it. Here Mr. Wales was enabled to get a sight of the moon for the second time since leaving the Cape of Good Hope, and taking several observations, fixed the position of the ship with tolerable accuracy. Changing the course to east-south-east, very foggy weather was encountered, accompanied by great cold, which coated the rigging with ice, rendering it pretty to the eye, but difficult and unpleasant to work. Cook says that, though this suggested very intense cold to the mind, in reality the thermometer was rather higher than it had been, and the sea was far less encumbered with ice. Taking large blocks of ice on board, it was found that, when the sea water was drained off, they provided perfectly fresh water on melting, thus removing a great weight from Cook's shoulders, and he determined on venturing further to the southward. On the 17th of January 1773 they crossed the Antarctic Circle in longitude 39 degrees 35 minutes east, and at noon their latitude by observation was 66 degrees 36 minutes 30 seconds south, the sea being free from ice. However, in the evening they found themselves completely blocked by an enormous field, extending as far as the eye could reach, from the southeast round to the west, and as the summer was nearly over, Cook decided it was unwise to attempt anything further southwards, and ordered a retreat to the north. Again making for the land claimed to have been discovered by the French, he spent some days searching for it, but nothing was seen except some floating weed, and a few birds that are supposed never to get far from land. On the 8th of February a brisk gale sprang up, accompanied by very hazy weather, thickening into fog, and the two vessels separated. The Resolution cruised about, firing guns and burning flares, but no response was heard, and when the weather cleared up, the Adventure was not seen. Poor Mr. Forster was dreadfully scared when he realised the two ships had parted company, He says that none of the crew ever looked around the ocean without expressing concern on seeing our ship alone in this vast and unexplored expanse. He seems to have been thoroughly unhappy, for he describes the whole voyage, from the Cape to New Zealand, as a series of hardships such as had never before been experienced by mortal man. Cook conjectured, rightly as it proved, that being a little to the south of Tasman's track, Furneaux would make for the rendezvous he had been given at New Zealand, and therefore felt himself free to push on to the south-east, as he judged that if any large body of land was in the vicinity, it must lie in that direction, for the swell coming from the south-west precluded the possibility of any mass of land being in that quarter. On the 17th of February a display of the Aurora Australis was reported to Cook, who speaks of it as something quite new to him, although Banks noted a display during the voyage of the Endeavour between Timor and Batavia. The present one is described as having a spiral motion, the direction not strongly defined, and at times quite strong flashes of light. A second display was seen on the 25th, but not so marked. On this day, too, some of the ship's boats engaged in watering from a small iceberg had a narrow escape from destruction as the berg turned completely over whilst they were at work. The weather becoming very unsettled, the Resolution was obliged to make to the north, and on the 8th of March, the finest day they had experienced since leaving the Cape, they were able to fix their position by observation as 59 degrees 44 minutes south, 121 degrees 9 minutes east, the thermometer registering 40 degrees. Of course this pleasant break was followed by a heavy gale, with a tremendously heavy sea, and the ship ran before it for New Zealand. Cook's wish was to touch at Van Diemen's Land, so as to satisfy himself as to its forming a part of New Holland, but the wind kept obstinately between west and north, having shifted after the gale, and he thought it would occupy a longer time than he could spare, so he bore up for the South Island. It was soon found that a few degrees of latitude made a great difference in the temperature, which we felt with an agreeable satisfaction. On the 25th of March at 10 a.m. New Zealand was sighted, and Cook steered in to the land with the intention of putting in to the first port that appeared suitable, but as the weather became very hazy, he thought it safer to stand off again. He had picked up the land at a point which he had only seen from a distance on his previous visit, and now saw it under so many disadvantageous circumstances that the less I say about it, the fewer mistakes I shall make. Dusky Bay. The following day they got safely into Dusky Bay, finding 44 fathoms at the entrance and a sandy bottom. In about a couple of leagues they found a good anchorage of 50 fathoms, a house's length or so from the shore. This was found to be rather inconvenient, but another one was soon found by Lieutenant Pickersgill, and received in consequence the name Pickersgill Harbour. Here the observatory, forge and tents were set up. Spruce beer was brewed, to which molasses and some of their inspissated malt juice was added, fish caught, and in fact everything possible for the comfort of the crew for a short time was done. They had been 117 days at sea, had sailed 3,600 leagues without a sight of land, and had arrived with only one man sick with the scurvy, occasioned chiefly by a bad habit of body and a complication of other disorders. One day, passing an island whilst out surveying, Cook was called by a Maori and landed to meet him. The native was accompanied by 2 women, and after an attempt at conversation, presented Cook with a piece of native cloth, asking, as far as could be understood, for a boat cloak in return. One was made for him out of red baize, and gave so much satisfaction that he presented Cook with his patoo, a sort of short flat club made of stone. He visited the ship and took great interest in all that was going on, particularly with the saw pit. After watching the men some time, he intimated his desire to try his hand in the pit, but found the work not quite so easy as it looked, and soon required very little persuasion to relinquish his task. Cook speaks very favourably of Dusky Bay, a good anchorage, plenty of good water, game, fish, and easy to enter. The timber he describes as the best he had seen in New Zealand, with the exception of that at the Thames. There was but little edible herbage, but he tried to remedy this by planting a quantity of European seeds, and he also left, in a place where he hoped they might be undisturbed, a pair of geese. Whilst here, Cook was for a time confined to his cabin by what he describes as a slight cold, but Mr. Forster says was a severe attack of rheumatism. After several unsuccessful attempts, owing to contrary winds, they left Dusky Bay on the 11th of May, and on the 17th, when near Cape Stephens, fell in with 6 waterspouts, one of which came within 50 yards of the ship, and Cook regretted he had not fired a gun at it, as he had heard that course recommended. He says he had one ready, but was so busy noting the phenomena that he did not think of it at the time. On the other hand, Forster says that one was ordered to be got ready, but our people being, as usual, very desultory about it, the danger was past before we could try the experiment. Furneaux reports. On the 18th of May they arrived at Queen Charlotte's Sound, finding, as Cook had expected, the Adventure there before them. Furneaux immediately reported himself to his commanding officer, and said that they had been there for 6 weeks. After they had lost sight of the Resolution on the 8th of February, they heard a gun and bore up for it, firing every half hour, but heard no reply. They then cruised about for 3 days, as near the spot as the weather would permit, and then, following Tasman's track, as Cook had surmised, made for New Zealand, sighting Van Diemen's Land on the 9th of March, near Tasman's South Cape. He sent a boat ashore at the first opportunity, and a few traces of natives were seen, but the weather was so threatening that the boat had to return to the ship. They then put into Adventure Bay, and staying 5 days, took in wood and water. They had been reduced to a quart per day of the last for some time. A few deserted huts and occasional smokes were seen, but no other signs of the inhabitants. They then continued up the coast till it trended away to the west, forming, Furneaux thought, a deep bay. Passing the islands which now bear Furneaux's name, bad weather came on, and he judged it wise to make for his rendezvous, firmly convinced that Van Diemen's Land was joined to New Holland. On the 30th of March they sighted the South Island, and were greatly retarded in their run up the coast by the heavy swell from the north. On their arrival in Queen Charlotte's Sound, they found the pole erected on Motuara, with the name of the Endeavour and date on it, and several of the inhabitants came forward to trade and inquire after Cook and Tupia. On the 11th of May they experienced the shock of having an earthquake, but no damage was done. Finding that several of the Adventure's crew were very sick, Cook immediately sent out boats for a supply of scurvy grass and gave orders that it should be boiled with wheat and portable broth every morning for breakfast, and with peas and broth for dinner. knowing from experience that these vegetables, thus dressed, are extremely beneficial in removing all manner of scorbutic complaints. Furneaux had prepared to winter in Queen Charlotte's Sound, but Cook thought it too soon to settle down to rest, and decided to push on. He was half inclined to go over to Van Diemen's Land and settle the question of it being a part of New Holland, but Furneaux appeared convinced, and the winds were contrary, so he decided on proceeding eastwards, and the Adventure was ordered to refit as rapidly as possible. A boat sent out for timber on the 3rd of June was chased by a large canoe filled with men, but Cook thought no harm was intended. On a second occasion some natives were on the ship when a large canoe came up, and those on board requested Cook to fire on it, saying its occupants were enemies. This Cook declined to do, and instead invited them to come on board, an invitation that was accepted after a brief ceremonial, and the newcomers behaved themselves quite properly. But soon Cook had to get rid of them all, for he found his men were selling their clothing, which they would shortly require, for things of no value either as curiosities or otherwise. The newcomers went off to Motuara, and Cook followed them up. He had some little conversation with them, but did not remember having seen any of them at his previous visit, and thought none of them recognised him. They had their cooking utensils with them, and he concluded they intended to settle down, at any rate for a time. Gardens had been started by Furneaux on his arrival, and Cook tried to interest the Maoris in them. He showed them the potatoes, carrots, and parsnips, which they seemed to understand and appreciate, and they promised to look after them. He remarks that the intercourse between the Maoris and the whites did not tend to improve the morals of the former, whom he had hitherto looked upon as superior in that respect to the other South Sea Islanders he had come across. The watch machine. On the 7th of June the two ships put to sea, and on the 8th some accident happened to Arnold's timepiece on board the Resolution, and they were unable to wind it up. So far it had been working very well, but not quite so accurately as Kendall's. On the return of the ship to England, Arnold was informed that either by carelessness or wilfully Mr. Wales had caused this difficulty. Wales attributed this rumour to the Forsters, to whom he wrote on the subject, and it is very evident from their replies that though they did not admit having circulated the report, they were not ignorant that Arnold had been so informed. There does not appear to have been any ground for the accusation, but it does appear very probable it originated with the Forsters. Throughout the rest of June they experienced very rough weather, and it was not till the 18th of July that they reached 133 degrees west, having seen no signs of land on their way. Cook therefore turned northward so as to cross the space between his track north and return south in 1769. This course would practically settle one view about the supposed southern continent, for it had been laid down by some of the theorists that it must be in the middle latitudes of the South Pacific. New Zealand had been said to be the western side of this continent, already disproved by Cook in his previous voyage, and what Forster calls the pretended discoveries near America, the eastern side. The proposed course would take the ships through the centre of the part of the ocean in dispute. On the 29th of July, Cook sent a boat to the Adventure, as he had heard her crew were very sickly, and found that about 20 of her men were down with scurvy, and the cook had died of the disease. Orders were given that the utmost precautions were to be taken, and wort, carrot marmalade, and rob of lemon were to be freely served out. on the Resolution, at the same time, 3 men were on the sick list, only one of whom had scurvy, but some of the others were showing symptoms, so similar precautions were taken, with good results. Dangerous waters. Cook was so anxious about the Adventure's crew that he would not look for Pitcairn Island, discovered by Carteret, although he believed he was in its neighbourhood on the 1st of August. He was about 15 leagues to the west, but a day or so after was able to have Furneaux on board to dinner, who reported a great improvement. He had some cider on board, which he had served out with gratifying results. 2 islands were sighted on the 11th, which Cook named Resolution and Doubtful Islands. He believed them to have been discovered by de Bougainville. The following morning at daylight they found themselves almost on top of what Cook calls a half-drowned island, or rather large coral shoal of about 20 leagues in circuit. In the lagoon which it surrounded they saw a large canoe under sail. The island was named after Furneaux. As they were now in such a dangerous neighbourhood, Cook ordered that at night the cutter with an officer and 7 men should keep in advance of the ships until they arrived in sight of Matia, Osnaburg Island, on the 15th of July, when, being in waters he knew, its services were discontinued. He steered for the south side of Otaheite in order to get fresh vegetables as soon as possible, and on the 16th at daybreak they found themselves about 2 miles from the reef. The wind dropped and the set of the current was taking them on to the reef, so the boats were ordered out to tow, but getting near an opening through which the tide was rushing with great force, they were unable to keep the ships off. The anchors were let go and the Adventure, finding holding ground, was brought up, but the Resolution was not so fortunate, and was carried on to the reef and struck 2 or 3 times, fortunately without doing any serious damage. A land breeze springing up and the tide slackening enabled them to get in safety, with the loss of 3 anchors, a cable, and a couple of houses. The bower anchor was recovered by Mr. Gilbert the next day. Cook says that though he thought they had a remarkably narrow escape, the natives who saw them did not seem to appreciate that they had been in any danger. They remained at this anchorage for a week and obtained plenty of coconuts and bananas, but though they saw hogs, they were unable to purchase any, as the people declared they had all belonged to their chief. So hearing he was in the neighbourhood, Cook landed to call on him, and at once recognised him as Teori, whom he had seen in 1769. The chief also remembered him, and inquired after several of the Endeavour people. He tried to get Cook to make a longer stay, promising supplies of fresh meat as an inducement, but as such promises had so often been broken before, Cook replied he should leave the next day. Whilst here, one of the marines, who had been ailing more or less all the voyage, had become dropsical, died, and the one man who was suffering from scurvy still remained on the sick list. On the other hand, the Adventure's crew had greatly improved in health with the change to fresh vegetables. One of the natives was found to have picked up coconuts, from which the sailors had drunk the milk, and having carefully sealed up the holes, resold them, and did not seem disconcerted when his trick was found out. Before the ships reached their anchorage at Matavai Bay, they were crowded with natives, many of whom Cook recognised, and almost all of whom knew him. Otoo, the king, at once recognised Cook, and inquired after Banks, Solander, and others of the Endeavour, yet Forster gravely asserts that he never saw them at the former visit. The old fort on Point Venus was reoccupied, tents pitched, and the observatory set up, and the camp was placed under the command of Lieutenant Edgecombe of the Marines. Spaniards hanged. The king gave a theatrical entertainment in honour of their arrival, at which his sister was the only female performer. It had some reference to the coming of the ships, but they were not able to follow the thread of the story. Cook could see that Otoo was nervous and uncomfortable, and felt dissatisfied with his reception, so determined to cut short his stay. No one could understand the reason of the unsatisfactory feeling, but Forster suggested it was owing to the advice of a Spanish deserter who had left his ship about March 1773. This vessel was commanded by Don Juan de Langara Uhuato, and was from Callao. Her voyage has not been published, but the natives gave Forster to understand that 4 of her sailors had been hanged on her arrival. Cook refers to the presence of a white man, who, when he thought he had been observed, disappeared and was not seen again. Young Forster made an attempt to explore the interior, but finding the climbing more difficult than he expected, soon returned. In the gardens which had been planted at the Endeavour's visit, pumpkins seemed to be the only things which had done well, and for these the natives did not care, which is not to be wondered at, said Cook. Further inquiries as to the religious ceremonies were made, but nothing very definite was ascertained. It appeared that on very rare occasions special criminals, selected by the high priests, were sacrificed at the Moris. Cook also formed the opinion that the standard of morality amongst the women was much higher than had previously been admitted. Sailing with a favourable wind on the 1st of September for Huahine, the Adventure ran ashore going through the reef, but with the assistance of the Resolution's boats she was soon towed off without serious damage. Forster, as usual, tries to cause trouble by declaring that Cook would not send assistance till the Resolution was safely anchored, and thus added to the danger of his consort. As the boats were in the water before the accident occurred, in order to render immediate assistance if required, Mr. Forster's story is too thin. On arrival, Cook was informed his old friend Oree was coming to see him, so he went ashore to meet him. The boat was hauled up close to the chief's house, and then 5 young plantain trees, as emblems of peace, were carried on board one by one, the first 3 being accompanied by a young pig with his ears ornamented with coconut fibre, the 4th was accompanied by a dog, and the 5th by the bag which Cook had given Oree in 1769, containing the pewter plate with the inscription relating to the Endeavour's visit, and the beads and imitation coins. On the advice of his guide, Cook decorated 3 of the plantains with nails, medals, beads, etc., and he and Furneaux and Forster landed with them in their hands. They were requested to sit down, and the trees were taken from them and placed before Oree, the first for God, the second for the king, and the third for friendship. The chief then came forward and greeted Cook in a most affectionate manner, the tears trickling down his cheeks. Further presents were then exchanged, and the ceremony was over. Sparrman's misadventure. Here they were able to purchase a plentiful supply of everything, pigs, fowls, and fruit, and Cook says that if he had been able to stay longer he might have bought as much more, as everything seemed abundant. The only disagreeable thing that happened was to Mr. Sparrman, who, out by himself botanising, was set upon and stripped of everything but his trousers. Besant substitutes spectacles for trousers. He made his way towards the boats, and was befriended by a native, who gave him some cloth to put over his shoulders and escorted him to the others. When Oree heard of the affair, he placed himself in Cook's hands, and did his best to find out the culprits, and after a time Sparrman's hanger and the greater part of his things were recovered. It seems probable that some native law had been unwittingly broken, and Sparrman's treatment was meant as a punishment, for everyone else had been particularly well treated. Before leaving, Cook added to Oree's treasures a copper plate, on which was inscribed, "Anchored here, His Britannic Majesty's ships Resolution and Adventure, September 1773. Some medals were also given him, and he was requested to show them to any visitors that came. At Ulitea they were received at a heava, or dramatic performance, one portion of which illustrated robbery by two men, and Cook says it was acted in such a masterly manner as sufficiently displayed the genius of the people in its vice. Fruit and vegetables being rather scarce, Mr. Pickersgill was dispatched with a boat from each ship to an island Cook calls Otaha, where they were said to be plentiful, and he was able to purchase as much as they had means to pay for, at a very reasonable rate, but during negotiations the bag containing the trade was stolen. Pickersgill at once seized everything of value he could lay his hands on, signifying at the same time that all should be returned when the bag and its contents were produced. In the evening a chief, who had been friendly all day, went off, and soon came back with the bag and about half its contents. Eventually all was recovered, and the boats left with good loads in a perfectly friendly manner. When the boats went from Ulitea, the crews of the two vessels were again entertained, but during the night all the natives disappeared, to the surprise and annoyance of Cook, who thought something serious had happened to offend them. It turned out that, seeing the boats did not return, the natives thought it was a case of desertion, and were afraid they might be held responsible. Bagpipes appreciated. Leaving here, the course was to the south of west, so as to clear the tracks of other explorers, and then to call at Middelburg and Amsterdam. Each night the ships lay to in order that they might not overlook any unknown island, and on the 23rd of September Harvey's Islands were sighted and named. On the 1st of October Middelburg was reached, but no good anchorage being found, they went on to Amsterdam. Before they got clear away, however, two canoes came out, and the coast opened up in a more promising manner. They ran in again, and found ground in 25 fathoms. Plenty of the natives, quite unarmed, came off to the ships. Some, amongst whom was a chief named Tiuni, were invited on board. The traders were so anxious to do business that those who could not get near enough to hand their goods into the boats pitched them over the heads of their friends. Some of the party accompanied Tiuni to his house, which was delightfully situated, and were entertained with refreshments in the shape of coconuts, bananas, and a few shaddocks, called by Forster Pumpelmoses, and music, and in return the ship's bagpipes played, to the great enjoyment of the natives. Turnbull, who visited the Pacific during the years 1800 to 1804, says that these instruments were remembered, and in Otaheite were specially asked for. The musical contribution of the natives commenced with a song by three girls, who sang rather nicely, and were duly rewarded with presents, whereon all the women began singing in a manner which Cook describes as both musical and harmonious. A short walk disclosed plantations well laid out and kept, but as edibles seemed scarce, a departure was made the next day for Amsterdam, the waves breaking high upon the rocks as they followed the coast. Off the southern point of Amsterdam several canoes came out, and their occupants came aboard without hesitation, presenting Kava root as a peace offering. The ships anchored in 18 fathoms, and was soon crowded with visitors. Nothing but cloth was offered for sale, so Cook, finding the sailors were parting with clothing they would soon be wanting, issued an order that no curiosities were to be purchased, with the result that next morning hogs, fowls, coconuts and bananas were forthcoming. Cook, Forster and some of the others went ashore and found a chief, Atago, who had attached himself to Cook, very useful in their trading. Mr. Hodges painted a picture of this landing, but as Mr. Forster very justly points out, the attire of the natives is far too classical. It was noticed that many of the natives had lost the top joint of the little finger of one, and in some cases of both hands. This was understood to be a mark of mourning for the loss of parents. The fowls here were remarkably good, and the sailors purchased some for the purpose of cockfighting, but they proved much more successful in the pot. The island is described as well cultivated, not an inch of ground being wasted in roads or fences. Forster reported having seen a large casuarina tree loaded with crows, but they proved to be that pest of the fruit grower, flying foxes. He also states that the Resolution anchored in the same spot as Tasman when he discovered the island. The natives proved as adept at thieving as the majority of the South Sea Islanders. One man, who had stolen some books from the master's cabin, got off in his canoe, and being chased, took to the water, and diving under his pursuer's boat, unshipped the rudder and got clear away. Mr. Wales, in going ashore, took off his shoes and stockings to save them from getting wet, when they were at once snatched up by a native, who ran off with them over the coral rocks, leaving poor Wales in what Cook called an unpleasant but laughable position, unable to follow over the sharp stone. However, Atago soon afterwards recovered them. The language was closely allied to that used in the Society group, many words being identical, and Cook concluded they had some form of religious worship, as he noted enclosing pieces of ground in which one or two particular men were accustomed to repeat speeches apparently of a set nature. End of chapter 13, part 1.